Well, howdy, everyone, and welcome back to the Rancher Podcast. I'm your host, Austin Halverson. This is one of the first video episodes I've ever done for the Rancher, so I'm excited to get into that. We're back with the Legendary Ranchers series today, and this is actually going to be a multi-part series because we are going to talk about someone who had an outsized impact on ranching in Texas, but we're also going to talk about the ranch itself and the empire that this man left behind. So today we're actually going to be talking about Christopher Columbus Slaughter, better known as C.C. Slaughter or Lum Slaughter or even the Colonel or Colonel Slaughter. The man of many nicknames earned them all along the way in a very storied lifetime. And, he's a fascinating character, very excited to talk about him. And he's somebody that not only had an outsized impact in ranching, but also in Texas politics, the Southern Baptist Convention. He was somebody who was extremely influential, and the 1800s, especially in Texas, were definitely shaped by this man. So, I'd like to say that Lum Slaughter had a dream. And I think that dream is something that you could consider the textbook definition of the American dream, because his dream was to work hard and rise from his birth class to build something that he could leave behind for his family to continue on and to build and to grow and to prosper. And, they say that wise men plant trees that they will never rest in the shade of. And I really think that Lum Slaughter was a wise man, because by his death, he had amassed a considerable fortune and hundreds of thousands of acres of ranch land in Texas. He made all of his decisions with his descendants in mind. He, of course, lived a very wealthy and successful life, but a lot of his money was tied up in assets that he thought would stand the test of time. And, he devised a sustainable model for ranching that would provide for the people that would come after him. But another saying that they have is that hard times make hard men, and that hard men make good times, but good times make weak men, and weak men, of course, make hard times. And I think that unfortunately plays true in Slaughter's story. For somebody who was born the year after Texas won its independence from Mexico and grew up in the hardscrabble Lone Star Republic, who had to figure out how to make money by transporting livestock and other goods before he was even a teenager. It was a hard time, and it made a hard man, but a successful one. Unfortunately, though, from his success, the Slaughter heirs proved to be weak men. Within years, not even decades, but within years of his death, his dream ranch, the 250,000 plus acre Lazy S Ranch that he had willed to the family, would be dismantled and sold for parts to, members of the family who really couldn't see the forest for the trees. And we'll get into more of that and just how big of a mistake they made, especially now that we know how much oil reserves are out in West Texas where the ranch was. But this episode is going to focus on the life of C.C. Lum Slaughter. So how did he build his American dreams? We're going to get into that and a whole lot more after a brief word from our sponsors. Well, I'm proud to welcome the newest sponsor for the Rancher Podcast, and that is Elite Ranch Consulting. They are your one-stop shop for protecting your real estate investment. Whether you inherited a piece of land, bought a ranch as your vacation home, or are simply looking to maximize the land you are already working, Elite Ranch Consulting's team of experts can help you make the right decisions to make your land profitable. Visit EliteRanchConsulting.com today to learn more about how they can protect your American dream. So C.C. Lum Slaughter had definitely an outsized impact on Texas history, but also, ranching history. I know a lot of what I do on this show seems fairly Texas-centric, and of course I am in Texas, so some of my resources are more geared towards that. But Ranching in general, he was a major player, especially around the turn of the century. And while I had known about Slaughter because there's towns named after him, there's streets named after him, he had a huge influence on Dallas, Baylor, all these places. I did not know exactly the story of the Lazy S Ranch, which is what kind of spurred me to do this series instead of just doing a legendary ranchers podcast on him. And so my father-in-law actually gave me this book, which is, you can see it's called The Rise and Fall of the Lazy S Ranch by David J. Murrah. And he gave it to me for Christmas, and it's a fun short read. It's about a little over 100 pages, but talks about exactly what happened with the legacy of C.C. Slaughter. So this first episode won't really refer to the book much at all. I did a lot of research online. The Texas State Historical Association, of course, was a great asset for this. But it's a fascinating story about what was going on around the same time as many of our other stories. You might have noticed from this podcast that kind of the golden age of ranching in America, when beef prices were high and everyone was wanting to get in, is somewhere after the Civil War through the early 1900s. That was really our golden era. And of course, ranching changed a lot in that time, right? We didn't have barbed wire fencing for the first part of it. And we had a lot of communal grazing, but with the advent of fencing and people buying property, it became a little bit more of a, modernized business, if you will. And so C.C. Slaughter is another character that plays perfectly into that time frame. Again, born in 1837, died in the 19 teens, around 1919. So he's a fantastic character to get a little bit more history, especially in Texas. And you'll notice he runs into some characters we've already talked to on the podcast. But I wanted to touch on the book. It is part of the Nancy and Ted Popp Ranching Heritage series that Texas A&M Press does. And that actually has a few other books that I've covered in the series, including the Chisholm Trail book. So I would really encourage you, if you listen to this podcast and you like the topics that are covered, you would most likely enjoy the Ranching Heritage series, and you can find them at TAMU, or Texas A&M University's press website. So I guess that gives us the question for today's episode, which is, what do we need to know about the man behind the Lazy S Ranch? Well, as I mentioned earlier, Slaughter, who was known as Lum or the Colonel, was born the year after Texas independence in Sabine County, which is on the Texas and Louisiana border. Much like much of East Texas, Sabine County looks way more like its neighbor Louisiana than the rest of Texas. When you think about Texas, obviously you like to think about the wide open, dusty plains of West Texas, or maybe you think about the hill country. But East Texas is a very unique and fantastic place in Texas that is really enveloped by pine trees. And my in-laws and my wife won't be happy with me saying this, but there is a term called the pine curtain, and so everywhere in East Texas is behind the pine curtain. And there's lots of beautiful towns, old school towns, like Marshall is one of them that was actually the capital of Missouri during the Confederacy, and they're kind of think more plantation-esque than the typical Texas town, and they thrived on the abundant rivers and the lumber in the region. Back in those days, it was much faster and much more efficient to travel via river than the roads, and so the Sabine River, which went through this area, the Trinity River, all of these places were going to play an outsized role not only in Lum's life, but many of the folks who lived in the area. So Sabine County today is actually sandwiched between two man-made lakes, and it boasts the Sabine National Forest. So still a very wild area, if you will. And like I said, my in-laws are from East Texas, and they say that folks from West Texas actually get kind of an uneasy or almost claustrophobic feeling due to the omnipresence of the piney woods. When you have these giant trees kind of closing you in on all sides, you might get a little claustrophobic if you're used to the plains of West Texas. When Slaughter was a teenager, he actually created a business where he would drive goods like cattle, lumber, and other necessities up the Sabine and Trinity rivers into what were brand new settlements in central Texas. Towns like Fort Worth were really just brand new in the middle of the 19th century when Lum was coming of age. And they were in constant need of supplies, basic necessities, food, water, shelter, to help them grow to what we see today. So him being the entrepreneurial individual that he was, he knew that this was a good time to capitalize on the good, fortunate resources that East Texas had and bring them into Central Texas to help build that growth. So then after earning quite a bit of money, there's reports that on certain trips he would make up over $500, which was quite the sizable sum back then. When he turned 20 years old, Slaughter and his father actually decided to get into cattle ranching. So they went and started a ranch in Palo Pinto County, which is a county that's on the west side of Fort Worth, just where modern day Graham and Mineral Wells and some of these other towns are. It's kind of what you think of, again, when you think of Texas. There's rivers. It's not fully mesquite yet. There's a few groves of scrub oaks and other oak, but it's beginning to look a lot more like how people in their mind imagine Texas to look. And he didn't make this choice on a whim. He, like I said earlier, he was an entrepreneur and he had business acumen. And when it came to cattle and land, Slaughter knew that you wanted to be able to produce the largest cattle, the best beef producing cattle on the cheapest land there was. And so he had actually studied and learned that there were stronger breeds that were being produced out of the western side of the state that were kind of coupled with the longhorns and that were essentially feral in the area, and that had made these cattle more hardy than some of the eastern domesticated bovine breeds. So they ran about 1,500 head, and they were actually able to get a contract to sell their beef to the local garrison that had been established at Fort Belknap, which, as I mentioned earlier, is not far from Graham, Texas. And this agreement also allowed them to earn money off feeding the Indian reservations nearby. So Fort Belknap was one of the forts that was established in Texas in the mid-1800s to defend the area against Indian predation. If you'll remember when we talked about in 1883 where they herded longhorns near Fort Griffin. Fort Griffin was a fort that was established around the same time. And these forts really weren't long-lasting. They kind of went out of style or went out of use as soon as the Indian question was answered, I guess. And they, were fantastic bulwarks, if you will, on the western frontier, but didn't last long. But they definitely served a purpose of protecting these small communities and spurring that growth into western Texas. So quite a profitable venture for him and his father to get into. And, by the time the Civil War broke out in 1861, Slaughter had already been running cattle for 10 years. And because of that, that his experience with running cattle, he didn't actually find himself on the front lines of the conflict. He wasn't being shot at in battles like Bull Run or Shiloh or any of these others, or in the siege of Vicksburg. Instead, he was placed in a Confederate protection unit on the frontier. And if you'll remember, one of the other legendary ranchers we've talked about, Charles Goodnight, was also in one of these protection units. And, I've covered in other episodes what they did, but essentially they had two primary missions. They needed to defend the outskirts of the South from Indian predation, which is something many of the cattle ranchers were already doing, and also maintain their herds of livestock to supply the Confederate Army with enough beef. And, some people might say he should have fought for his country. Obviously, with his country being the South, there's lots of mixed opinions on, what he, his morals or what he was doing, if that would have been right or wrong. But, he, regardless of what you think, he was on a very important wartime assignment. And, even though he's not engaging with Union soldiers, I think it was more important at that time to be protecting the settlements from Indian predation, which could be quite brutal at times, and really wasn't a question of slavery or whatnot. It was about survival of, the state of Texas. So the second part of that, of course, is that there's a lot of truth in the old adage that an army marches on its stomach, and being in the beef producing side of things was very important. It's just as important as carrying a rifle on the battlefields in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and throughout the South. So it was actually during the Civil War that Slaughter earned one of his many nicknames when he was made a colonel in the Texas Rangers. The Texas Rangers is a fascinating group. I know I've talked about them a few times. My grandfather was actually a Texas Ranger, and throughout the years they've served numerous roles. When the revolution in Texas was going on, they were of course a part of the Army, and they stayed a part of the Lone Star Republic's Army until they joined the Union in the mid 1840s, and at that point essentially became more of a police force, National Guard, if you will, and then of course were reactivated into the military during the Civil War, and today are part of the Department of Public Safety here in Texas and serve in more of a detective role. So fascinating group that Slaughter was a part of, and interestingly enough, he was actually in the same unit as Charles Goodnight and Lawrence Sullivan Ross, and they were the ones that found Cynthia Ann Parker, who, of course, we've told the story before, but is the mother of the famous and last chief of the Comanches, Quanah Parker. So, I like to joke that it seems like anyone who was anyone in 19th century Texas was in the raid that saved her and a member of the Texas Rangers. So, fascinating story there. And, while there were hardly any Union soldiers to fight on the Texas plains during the war, there were a few, and there were a few skirmishes out in New Mexico that were fairly intense, but Slaughter and his group really didn't interfere in that. Instead, they had their hands full with the Comanches, the Apaches, and the Kiowas. And there was an estimate that more than 10,000 head of cattle were actually stolen during the war by the Native Americans, which is absolutely fantastic, of a story. It's so interesting to think, you're fighting somebody, but then there's this third party that's coming in and essentially harassing you on the back end. One of the things that we don't talk about a lot with the Civil War is that it's a lot like other wars, right? In the sense that it builds brotherhood, right? We think about Band of Brothers, which was a fantastic series about one of the airborne divisions during World War II and how those men, their lives were changed forever, and they became truly brothers for a lifetime. And when we talk about the Civil War, we tend to focus more on the tearing apart of families that had folks in the North and in the South, brother against brother, these types of things. But there was also a bonding factor to the war, and Slaughter and Goodnight became beneficiaries of that bonding. They worked together, they accrued knowledge together, and because of that became very good business partners. And they even devised plans to partner on stuff. I know we'll get into it later with the ranching history, but Slaughter bought a lot of Herefords from Charles Goodnight's ranch, and they really wanted to get into business and make cattle ranching on the Texas plains profitable. But they even thought of moving further south into Old Mexico, south of the Rio Grande, where the Native Americans really wouldn't be able to harass them as much. There weren't as many tribes down there. Comancheria didn't reach all the way down past the Rio Grande River. And so they devised after the Civil War that they would go south and try and scout out those lands. This is another fascinating look into Slaughter's life, because it turned out to be a short venture, because just a few miles south of the Rio Grande, they got tangled in what, I guess would be accurately described as a brush thicket. And one of the men's rifles actually discharged and shot Slaughter in the hip. And they thought, he might die. It was dire consequences. He laid in camp for months, unable to move while this wound continued to worsen. But finally, after a while, he was able to recover. But that really kind of ended their expedition south, and the Slaughter Ranch and the Goodnight, JA Ranch stayed in Texas. Not only did it incapacitate Slaughter for almost a year, but it really nearly ruined his cattle business. It's hard to manage a herd of cattle or anything else when you can't sit up or sit in a saddle. So he recovered quite enough, and he actually tried to drive cattle to New Orleans in 1867, but he actually found a buyer in the Jefferson area, which I mentioned earlier. Marshall, Jefferson, these towns that are in East Texas are very much the center of commerce for Texas at this time. And someone there bought his 300 steers for $35 a head, which, again, we talked about he would make pretty good money in the 1840s with traveling, up the Sabine and Trinity rivers at around $500. And now he's making $35 on each of his 300 head. This is quite the fortune for a man. And he actually began to drive cattle up to Kansas City in 1868, and he would get $42 a head. So if you can see, Slaughter has found himself a profitable business, and one that continues to get more and more profitable. So he actually sold a lot of his ranching interests in 1871 and 73 and organized a larger company, the C.C. Slaughter Company. And this cattle breeding venture, would take the poor longhorn, feral longhorn breeds and combine it with some of the breeds from out east, the shorthorn stock of Kentucky and other places, and try and, create a hardy beef cattle, if you will. And by 1882, they were shipping their herd to St. Louis, and they were receiving $7 per 100 pounds. So, take that to take that into your calculations. Typically, I don't know what their cattle were running in weight at that time, but that's a much higher price than what he was even getting per head back in the day. And so, he actually moved his family to Dallas in 1873, and at that time he became essentially one of the largest landowners in Texas. He started opening banks and getting into business ventures throughout Dallas, and established the largest ranch in Texas, which was the Long S Ranch on the headwaters of the Colorado. And there were no barbed wire fences, and so there was just wide open plains all along the Colorado. And this ranch actually was, just to try and describe the immensity of it. If you look at a map, find where Big Spring, Texas is, which is not too far from Midland, and go all the way north of Lubbock, north of the town of Lubbock. It was more than 1 million acres that he was running his cattle on at this time. And, he started to abandon the feral longhorn cattle breeds and move more towards what I would call sophisticated cattle breeds, ones from, England and the old world. And his favorite were the Herefords. And of course, those quickly became the standard in Northwest Texas, which is why we have the town of Hereford, Texas, which still to this day boasts a staggering number of feedlots and produces quite a bit of beef every year. Now, I know it's kind of hard to get a solid picture of someone like Slaughter, who was so involved in so many, not only historical events, but business ventures and other things. But, let's take a quick look back. So we established that in the 1830s, he was born. In the 1840s, he had started transporting goods throughout Texas. And into the 50s, he had, built up a successful cattle ranching business. And in the 1860s, of course, had to go to war. But the 1870s were the time where really all of his business became successful, or let's say he reaped the fruits of his labor. So he accumulated quite a bit of political power throughout the 70s. He founded what was called the Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association, and it's known as the TSCRA today, the Texas Southwestern Cattle Raisers. And it's a very fascinating organization. Not only are they folks that raise cattle and whatnot, but they actually, to this day, have their own special rangers. And it's a unit of peace officers that specialize in cattle theft. And, the creation of this organization brought further organization to the wild frontier that was ranching in Texas. Now, I know if you've listened to my Cattlecade episode, you'll remember there was the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, which is still in effect today. And, you can't say that everyone was always good intentioned with these places, but the TSCRA was, fairly, positive impact on the ranching industry. They really wanted to defend not only from Indian predation, which was slowly going away, but also protect, obviously with feral cattle going around and whatnot. The Texas herds were susceptible to different types of diseases. They would call them ticky cattle sometimes, and they would have fever. And so the organization was kind of more of a positive impact. And he built this organization into a powerhouse that still exists today, and it's one of the strongest, healthiest cattle raising organizations in the world. But Slaughter, he had the Long S Ranch, that millions of acres in West Texas that he was running cattle on. But as he started to build more and more, he tried to get more sophisticated, right? And one of my favorite properties is actually, he had an alfalfa farm near Roswell, New Mexico, and he named it the Hereford Home. And that's where he actually kept his prized Hereford bulls, which were named Sir Bredwell and Ancient Britain. And, Slaughter was, an entrepreneur to the bone. So when he bought these two Herefords, he actually designed a special train car that had their pictures on it. And, I haven't been able to find anything online that accurately, any photos of it, but think about the old school, posters, if you will, where there would be portraits of two men painted, and they would, think like old circus almost, posters and advertisements. And he did that for Sir Bredwell and Sir Britain, from the descriptions I've heard. And he knew that when these cattle were coming from Kansas down to Roswell, folks in the towns along the railroads and also in the ranches would be able to see that. And it was a great marketing ploy, right? Because the people would want to say, I want to breed my cattle to these two bulls that are so important that they are brought to their new home via rail car, decorated with their name and image on them. So quite the businessman and innovator, if you will, at that time. And it was also the Roswell property itself was a shrewd investment because the favorable climate for his prize bulls would keep them alive longer, and secondly, it was a hedge against if there were to be fires or any type of drought or anything that would impact his grass production on his ranches in Texas. He could utilize the alfalfa to supplement his herds that were on the Long S Ranch. So, quite an interesting story there. And, going back to trying to establish this man and, the Colonel Lum Slaughter, if you will, what he was doing in the 1870s. He also founded Citibank in Dallas, and by the 1880s, he was serving on the boards of countless banks. He had been the president of Citibank, and he held the very unfortunate title of being the largest taxpayer in Texas, which I don't think anybody wants to be known for that, but he definitely held that title, which I guess brings with it an air of sophistication and largesse, but I definitely would not want to be known as the largest taxpayer in any state or country or anywhere. And what we were seeing here, though, was that through his decades of hard work, he was amassing this very large fortune. And, around the turn of the century, he was trying to figure out a way to sustain that fortune even after he left this world, even after he was called home to the Lord. He wanted this money to stay in his family, these resources to stay in his family, to help set them up for success in their lives. So the big question, of course, was how was he going to do that? Well, we'll get into that and a whole lot more on the next episode of The Rancher. But until then, Godspeed and God bless.